something new for us, outside and live. It's a learning process. Thanks to the support from the board and you folks, it's working. And today we are gathering together as the Church of the Good Shepherd, reflecting and celebrating on Remembrance Day. So let us open just by taking a moment to close our eyes and connect with what Remembrance Day means for us. Taking a few deep breaths. Allowing the Spirit of God to point to our connections to those living and past. All the soldiers who've given their lives for their people, their countries. For the shining examples in our histories and in our midst and in ourselves that seek to uplift life and justice in the world, that hope to increase the welfare of all, virtuosity and trustworthiness. As we also open our hearts to worship and what the Spirit has to tell us today. Amen.
Daniel 6, 1 through 23. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of the government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God." So the administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, "May King Darius live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown in the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the laws of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed." So King Darius put the decree in writing. Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home up to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. When these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help, so they went to the king and spoke to him about the royal decree. "Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being, except you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den?" The king answered, "The decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed." Then they said to the king, "Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day." When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed, and he was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, Remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict that the king has issued can be changed." So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve, continually rescue you." A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him. He could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" Daniel answered, "May the king live forever. My God has sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They've not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I done anything wrong before you, your majesty." The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in God.
Lovely reading. Thank you, Alyssa. So we continue our exploration of Daniel today with a new king. It might be a surprise to a few of you if you've been following along. King Nebuchadnezzar passed in the recent history in our text, and his son took over, and his son was actually deposed. He lost his kingship and his life, I believe, because of his own pride. And we heard before how Nebuchadnezzar had to struggle with his pride and was eventually raised back to king because he started to accept the reality of divinity in his life, that we don't have power in and of ourselves, but it comes from something greater. And I think it's that belief in something greater that a lot of our soldiers, armed forces, police officers, and many public servants come into their work for. It's their orientation towards life and trustworthiness and virtuosity. And yet often, as we've seen, unfortunately, these structures in our communities meant to keep us safe and uplift the health of all can often be used for harm. As you all know, and many of you as well, we are celebrating Remembrance Sunday today because on Wednesday here in Canada is our Remembrance Day. And I think it's an important holiday. It's one that kind of gets short shrift in Veterans Day in the US. So I appreciate the difference of how you take it so seriously and celebratorily, because we tend to overlook the sacrifices that our fellow citizens make and the importance of what often brings them into those roles, that type of Daniel-like orientation. As we heard in our story, Daniel was rising through the ranks in Babylon with the administrators and the satraps, or however you say it. And he gained some enemies just by being decent at his job. And they were also upset because they couldn't find any corruption in his ways, and he wasn't, or he was trustworthy and he wasn't negligent. And so to destroy him, they influence the powers that be to kind of pick up on something they could use against him, which was his faith. And they went to the king, King Darius now, and said, you know, you should just make a decree that for 30 days, hardly any days at all, the only person and not a god that someone could worship is you. If anyone worships a god or another person during these 30 days, according to law, we'll send them to the lion's den. And he agrees for whatever reason. And it's a decree that can't be taken back. They say it's part of whatever structure they added it to. And I think it's funny because in our religions, we kind of behave like this often, where we only want people who see things exactly our way. It's kind of a theme of Daniel, funny enough, this king syndrome of forcing people into kind of a narrow idea of faith and belief and worship, even prayer. And we see King Darius take after the early King Nebuchadnezzar with this decree. And of course, Daniel, being one of the captured Israelites here in Babylon, continues to pray to his God. When he's caught, he's taken, and despite the king's frustrations with this, because he loves Daniel already, put into the lion's den for the night. Unfortunately, I think sometimes our loyalty to the greater good can put us in a similar lion's den. We hear these stories in police precincts in the US especially, but I'm sure all over the world, where the officer willing to speak out is the one that's fired, that is harassed and threatened. But I don't think it's true only in police precincts. I think often it's the person willing to stand up for what they think is the greater good that gets, pressured and hurt by that stance. And I think the more that person orients themselves to what is at the heart of that greater good, the more they're able to overcome even those tough trials. I think that's true for our own lives as well. Because as in Daniel's story, it's his trustworthiness, it's his deep faith that carries him through the lion's den. And I think that's also what carries our soldiers, even to the end of their life, through the toughest times and some of the harshest circumstances we could ever imagine. I think often we see the opposite, though. We see entire communities centering on something greater. And that still sometimes lands them and aligns them. We see it with some of the world wars, when our armed forces stood up for those being oppressed and hurt, reacted to unlawful, horrific force with force. And that was its own lion's den, of course. And thankfully, we made it through. We overcame, in some ways, the forces of fascism and pain and hurts at that time, seeking to destroy and dominate and literally control even how people look and everything else in the world. And came out the other side with a renewed sense of hope and peace and interconnectedness. I think the more we center on that love, that compassion for those being hurt and oppressed, the better off we all are. We see what happens when we get a little off in that way. When us personally and as a community, our motives kind of become more selfish. It's about my church, it's about my faith, it's about me, just my way. Instead of it's about people and life and love and compassion. We see it in our politics, this corrupt attitude that brings us down. We see it on the world stage. And so it's important for us to remember those Daniel-like attributes. That spiritual health that he focuses on. For him, it's his prayer life. It's his orientation to Jehovah, divinity. It's clearly his orientation towards service, trustworthiness. We tend to make it more about a specific label in some way, one way or another, or ourselves. And we forget that it's really actually those qualities that we should orient ourselves to. It's those things that we're told have their seat in God. It's also the life around us, of course, that has its seat in God. But we tend to kind of think of some of these things as peripheral sometimes, these good motives, compassion, peaceful heart. We get caught up. It's easy. We get caught up in our job and whatever we have going on. And we're often not told. We often, don't take the time, and the structures really aren't there in our schooling to uplift this all the time. We hear it from our teachers. That's what often makes a good teacher, is their natural tendency to uplift these healthy motives. But the schoolwork itself tends to be something a little bit more mathematic or historical, some type of memory orientation, instead of these deep-seated living things in our hearts that come from God. Now, as we know, all our soldiers don't make it through the lion's den alive in the way that we often hope. Our hearts mourn for them. We miss them. Whether it's for a just cause or non-just, often our soldiers are doing what they think is right through the leadership of their country. And so I think it's right to grieve those losses, to mourn their spirit and their dedication. And it just, again, highlights the importance of centering ourselves on these healthier things, slowly working through and letting go of the more hurtful motives that we are often blind to, because that's just us, right? That prideful stance, that whatever it is, that's just me. I've had it forever. Just becoming more attuned to those foundational things. Is mic up? Like mic working. This one is on here. Maybe it's dying here. So I'll take that as my cue to be attuned to the Spirit and God's leadership. Because as we know, when we forget the Spirit and that it's truly God leading us, we can fall to the wayside and lose that spirit of hope that shines through the many that we've lost. Taking a moment to close our eyes and breathe deeply. Allowing that sense of connectedness to those we've lost, the soldiers and servants of the past, and in our families and friends. That connection to be uplifted in our spirit, knowing that they are never lost, that no one's ever lost. Thank you, Donna. Tradition after tradition, whether it's an afterlife or reincarnation, so that we continue to be in deep connection with those in our lives into nirvana eventually. That even when it seems like someone's lost to the lion's den, they're coming out the other side. May we hold those oppressive times, those hurtful times in our own lives, like Daniel, centered on the qualities that are truly real, even in comparison to the material world around us. Those things that make life possible. Those fundamental truths, connections, higher dynamics of community that build up into the creation around us. In celebration of those, even today, willing to give their lives for the greater good. Allowing that spirit to continue to grow within us. Letting go of even a sense of egoic self. Who are we really without God and each other? Even in our isolation, if we feel like we're cast out or unable to connect in community, knowing that there is a deep spiritual community in God and heaven in control of this journey towards greater health, holding our mistakes and our foibles, looking ahead to that time when we walk out of the lion's den, deeper into God's embrace.